how there's many different ways to do a PowerPoint over Zoom, and none of them are really good. So it's kind of odd. So yeah, thank you for that wonderful introduction. I'm so excited to be here. I'm here tonight because I am the author of a book on how we know what we know about bird migration. I have spent the last several years of my life immersed in this topic. I have read more scientific papers than I could possibly count. I have talked to dozens of scientists, including not only ornithologists, but a really surprising number of computer scientists and electrical engineers and folks like that. I have joined a few of those ornithologists in the field while they have been doing their work, which was really amazing. And I feel really privileged to be able to tell the stories of the scientists who are profiled in this book. I still feel like they're the real experts, and I'm just here trying to bring the amazing things that they're doing to a wider audience. And it's a really fun job to have because there are so many good stories to tell about bird migration. So on the left here, well, these are a few of the amazing migrators whose stories appear in my book. If it's supposed to be my seg there. And on the left, the lower left, this is the bar-tailed godwit, which I'm sure some of you have heard of. This bird famously in the fall makes a nonstop flight from Alaska all the way across the Pacific Ocean without touching down to New Zealand and other points in that area, which is amazing. In the middle, this is the bird that makes what's probably the highest altitude bird migration in the world. This is the bar-headed goose, which flies over the Himalayan mountains every year when it's going back and forth. And in the upper right, we have the blackpoll warbler. These little guys, to get from New England down to their wintering grounds in northern South America, they just launch themselves out over the open waters of the Atlantic Ocean for 3 days, which sounds a little bit less impressive than the bar-tailed godwit crossing the Pacific until you remember that a godwit is about the size of a football and a blackpoll warbler weighs about the same as a ballpoint pen. So it's just mind-boggling. And yeah, it's amazing. But for me, what fascinates me just as much as what migrating birds do and how they do it is how we figured all of this out. And so that's what my book is really about. And that's what I'm here to talk about tonight. Before I dive into that, I want to give just a little bit more background about me and how I came to write this book. So before COVID, I worked full-time for the American Ornithological Society, which is the big professional organization in the US for scientists who study birds. They do things like put on an annual research conference. They give out grants to fund research. And they also publish 2 peer-reviewed scientific journals, which are what you see here. So this is where scientists would publish their new findings. My job with them, I was their one-person communications department. So as you would imagine, I wore a lot of hats. But a big part of my job was promoting the research being published in these journals to, the science news media and to the public. And so I was reading a lot of scientific papers. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with the structure of the scientific paper, but they all follow the same basic format. So they start with the introduction, where the researchers explain what question they were trying to answer and why it's important. Then there's the methods, where they go step by step through exactly how they did their experiment. And then there's the results and discussion, where they explain what they found and why it matters. And so I was reading all these papers and I kept getting sucked in to the section that I think most people kind of skim through to get to the good stuff, which is the methods, the how. I didn't know, or if I had learned in my undergraduate ornithology class years before, I had forgotten, that you can study bird migration using weather radar. You can study it by putting out microphones to passively record the calls of birds flying overhead at night. You can study it by analyzing rare hydrogen isotopes in bird feathers. And I'm not even going to get into that one tonight, but it's just wild. And so I started thinking, how did we even figure out that all of this was possible? And who figured it out? And what's the science behind how some of these things work? And so when the pandemic began, I became one of the statistic of however many millions of people left their pre-pandemic jobs. And I ended up writing a book proposal. And so that became my book, Flight Paths, which was published in March of last year. This is the table of contents. I suppose if we had time, we could make it a guessing game and you could try to match which title here goes with which technique, because basically I just go chronologically, chapter by chapter, over each of the major methods that have been developed for studying bird migration, beginning with bird banding and going all the way up through things like high volume genetic sequencing. But when I started thinking about how I might adapt this into a 45-minute, give or take, book talk, I mean, there's no way I can cram all of this into one talk. So I decided that the best, most fun way to do it would be to sort of zoom in on 3 of my favorite stories from the book. And so that's what I'm going to do this evening. I'm going to share the stories of 3 of my favorites, historical figures from the history of bird migration research, who were kind of some quirky characters, and the stuff that they figured out and how they did it. And I'm going to conclude by talking a little bit about migratory connectivity and why all of this matters for bird conservation. So my hope is that you will come away from this evening with a new appreciation of all the hard work and creativity that went into uncovering any gee whiz facts that you might ever hear about bird migration. Excuse me. So the first tactic for figuring out what migratory birds are doing that I want to talk about is one that I had not even heard of before I started doing the research for this book, and this is called moon watching. So most birds migrate at night. I'm sure this audience, a lot of you know that. Songbirds especially, they primarily migrate at night. And that means that in addition to the fact that they're flying pretty high up, it's dark, so you can't see them. If you want to know what they're doing, you have to get kind of creative about it. And today we have all sorts of high-tech tools like radar, which we're going to talk about, and satellite telemetry to kind of spy on what these night migrating birds are doing. But before any of that technology was developed, this guy, whose name was George Lowry, came up with a really clever way to do it using just a telescope. George Lowry was born in Louisiana in 1913, and he was fascinated with birds from the time that he was a kid. In 1936, he finished his master's degree in zoology from the University of Louisiana in Baton Rouge, and he stayed on there for the rest of his career as an instructor and an ornithologist, and he helped found LSU's Museum of Zoology, which is still going strong today. Now, living along the coast of Louisiana and being really interested in birds, George Lowry would have been very familiar with the phenomenon of migratory fallout. So again, I'm sure some of you are familiar with this. This is when birds that are crossing the Gulf of Mexico north in spring as part of their migration, depending on what's going on with the weather patterns, like if there's a headwind, they will basically just fall out of the sky en masse at the first little bit of land that they get to. So you can get these amazing concentrations of every migratory songbird you might think of sort of dripping out of the trees right up against the beach. And although there wasn't really any way to prove it at the time, in the early 20th century, based on circumstantial evidence like this, a lot of ornithologists, including George Lowry, thought that it was likely that migrating birds crossed over the open water of the Gulf of Mexico on a regular basis, that this was just a normal, common part of bird migration. But then in the 1940s, another biologist, whose name was George Williams, they're both named George, I'm sorry, but bear with me. So George number 2, George Williams, comes along and says, hang on, this doesn't make any sense. Why would all of these birds voluntarily decide to fly over 500 miles of open water when Mexico is right there? Basically, he said, even though people never really see these birds in Mexico in large numbers, they must just be sticking to a narrow route along the coast or flying too high to easily be observed. Basically, he said, they've got to be there. We're just not looking hard enough because it's the only thing that makes sense. Now, George Lowry, who had again seen the evidence of large-scale migration over the Gulf with his own eyes as all these birds materialized out of the air on the coast of Louisiana, was really annoyed by this and really determined to prove George Williams wrong. And so he started casting about for a way that he might do that. And he remembered some quirky ornithology papers from the very early years of the 20th century, where folks had reported looking at the full moon through a telescope during bird migration and being able to see the silhouettes of night migrating birds passing in front of the moon. And he thought, I bet I could do something with that. Now, luckily for George Lowry, there was an astronomer also working at LSU at the time who was an avid birder, really into birds. So Lowry and this astronomer, they put their heads together, and what they came up with was a set of equations that would let George Lowry take raw data, a raw count of the number of birds passing in front of the moon in a given amount of time, and do some math and turn that into an estimate of the total number of birds crossing an imaginary 1 mile line on the Earth's surface every hour, which I realize that's very abstract. If it's a little hard to picture, I get why. But what it boils down to is this gave George Lowry a way to directly compare how much migration was going on at one place in time with how much migration was going on at another place in time. And there had never really been a good way to do that before. So this was really exciting. Lowry called this the migration traffic rate, and he thought that with this, he finally had a tool to demonstrate the volume of birds passing over the Gulf during migration. So April 1945, George Lowry's all excited. He packs up his telescope and he gets on a boat heading across the Gulf of Mexico for a port on the Yucatan. It's like, all right, I'm going to do it. I'm going to prove George Williams wrong. This is my big chance. Here I go. He goes up on deck the first night and he sets up his telescope and he points it at the moon. He's so excited. He puts his eye up to the eyepiece. George Lowry did not have any experience at sea, and he had not anticipated the fact that when he looked through the eyepiece, the moon, thanks to the action of the waves, would be bobbing up and down in a way that made it impossible to get an accurate count of birds flying in front of it. So, failure. But George Lowry was not a man who gave up easily. He spent the rest of the trip painstakingly writing down every bird that he saw fly past the ship. And finally, they docked in the Yucatan at a port where the water was calmer. And so Lowry tried again. He set up his telescope. He pointed it out at the moon out over the Gulf. And in 45 minutes, he counted 12 birds passing in front of the bright disk of the moon. That might not sound a lot, but when he did the math, this worked out to more than 3,700 birds passing over an imaginary 1 mile line extending out into the Gulf every hour. So Lowry had just collected the first hard numerical evidence that large-scale trans-Gulf migration was real. Take that, George Williams. Now, Lowry was just getting started. He knew he was on to something powerful with this. And his next idea for moon watching was to scale it up and recruit volunteers from across North America to collect this type of data. Today, we would call this citizen science or community science. And there's a whole chapter in my book just about how community science has contributed to our knowledge of migration. But in the 1940s and 50s, those terms hadn't been coined yet. Lowry just knew that he had hit on a method that had the potential to reveal migration patterns at the scale of the whole continent for the first time, but he wasn't going to be able to do it alone. So luckily for Lowry, right about this time, an enthusiastic young grad student arrived at the Zoology Museum at LSU. So this is Lowry again on the right, or excuse me, Lowry again on the left. And then on the right, we have our new character, Bob Newman. Now, this is clearly not Bob Newman as an enthusiastic young graduate student. One thing I learned in the course of putting this together was that in the pre-smartphone era, people did not have a lot of photos of themselves that ended up getting published until later in their careers when they became famous. So I could not find any photos of young grad student Bob Newman. You'll have to use your imagination. But like Lowry, Bob Newman ended up staying on at LSU for the rest of his career. And these two men formed a working partnership that lasted until Lowry's death in the 1970s. Now, Newman also passed away decades ago, so I did not get to speak to either of these men when I was researching my book. But I did get to talk to an ornithologist now in his 80s who worked with both of them when he was a grad student at LSU. And from the things that he shared with me, it sounds like in a lot of ways, these two men could not have been more different. They were sort of the odd couple of ornithology. George Lowry was an old school gentleman naturalist who I think would have been right at home in the 19th century. He wore a suit and tie for field work. He organized expeditions into the jungle to gather specimens for the University Museum. He was a workaholic who would go home to eat dinner with his wife and then sneak back into the office in the evening to get a little more work done. Bob Newman, on the other hand, for one thing, he had a reputation as a jokester. He was someone who liked a good prank, but he also approached problems a lot more like a modern scientist. He taught himself statistics before that was a common skill for zoologists. You did not need to know statistics to be a biologist in the 1940s and 50s. And he made it a personal mission to keep up with the latest bird migration research being published all over the world. Together, these two men came up with a plan to collect a snapshot of migration activity across the entire continent during a single week in October. No one had ever tried anything like this before. This was before the internet. It was technically not before computers. There were probably a few primitive computers in the US at this time, but these two guys definitely did not have access to them. So the way they did this was they spent up to 12 hours a day handwriting personal letters to hundreds of potential volunteers all over the country, targeting a lot of local Audubon chapters like you guys, explaining the goals of their project and what would be required of data collectors and the special contribution that each participant would be making to science. And they eventually recruited 2,500 volunteers in 325 locations from Canada down into Panama. Once I gave this talk, and when I was done, a little old man raised his hand and said, I was one of those data collectors, and that was an amazing moment. I loved that. But so Lowry and Newman really wanted to make sure that the data that they collected was as high quality and reliable as possible. So they even took the step of printing up a how-to pamphlet to mail off to all of their volunteers, complete with some advice on how to keep yourself comfortable for long stints of staring up at the sky. I mentioned that Bob Newman was known for his sense of humor. I still cannot decide if this particular illustration was supposed to be funny or if it was just the 50s. I don't know, but my jaw dropped when I came across this. This is an actual figure from their how-to pamphlet. Anyway, in fall 1952, telescopes finally swung into action across North America. And now observations were flooding in, and paper data sheets mailed from every part of the country were stacking up higher and higher and higher on Lowry and Newman's desks. And they realized that they had another problem, which they probably should have given more thought to ahead of time, which was how to analyze all that data. Again, this was before computers. It was before most zoologists even had any training in statistics. They now needed to calculate the average direction and volume of bird migration at all of these hundreds of locations. They wanted to look for patterns to see if migration was related to the weather. So they had to look up data on temperature and wind and cold fronts for each of these locations and look it up in a printed record book. They had to check for patterns in how migration related to weather across the entire continent. And then they had to depict all of this on easy to interpret maps, which they would have to draw by hand. It took them 14 years to complete and publish their analysis. Finally, in 1966, their magnum opus appeared in the ornithological journal, the Auk, which was one of the same ones that I would be working for about 5 decades later, which is fun. They called it a continent-wide view of bird migration on 4 nights in October. It included these painstakingly crafted maps where they used arrows colored red, black, and white to indicate the volume as well as the direction of migration at locations across the continent on these nights of October 1st through 4th, 1952. And in the Midwest and East, you could see these massive migratory flights that spanned multiple states with really consistent locations from many locations about how many, consistent reports from many locations about how many birds were passing over and what direction they were heading in. They could clearly see that favorable winds and the movement of cold fronts both clearly affected migration patterns across the continent, with the heaviest migration occurring in front of advancing cold fronts. And I'm sure there might be some of you who like to check the weather forecast during migration to try and guess when the next big wave of birds is going to hit your area. So now this idea of migrants riding advancing weather fronts is pretty familiar. But to see this at such a large scale would have been totally new at the time that this was published. I feel like today, when we have, satellite imagery of the Earth and everything, it's almost hard to imagine how revolutionary a continent-wide map of bird migration like this must have been. This paper was a blockbuster. It was 40 pages long. It influenced studies of migration for years to come. It was also the last moon watching paper that Lowry and Newman would ever publish together, because all of this hard work was about to be made just about obsolete by the rise of a new technology, which was radar. So we're moving on to my second story of the evening here. I'm sure some of you have seen an image like this before. This was taken from the nationwide weather radar system, the same one that you see images from on the Weather Channel with the green and orange blobs to show you where the rainstorms are. You can see some rain on this map. It's over on the East Coast, but all of those round blobs down the middle of the continent are birds. Now, they generally filter migrating birds and other distractions out of the radar images that they use for TV weather reports. But birds actually show up really well on radar. And during migration, there are so many birds lifting off at dusk for their night of flying that they just completely saturate the field of view of individual radar stations when there's a big movement going on. And so each of these round blobs is just the complete field of view of one individual radar location that's now being totally filled with birds. But when people first started using radar in a big way, it hadn't occurred to anyone yet that they might pick up birds. They weren't looking for birds, and they weren't looking for rainstorms either. They were looking for Nazi planes. So I'm going to get a tiny bit technical just for a moment here. Radar stands for radio detection and ranging. Basically, how it works is a special transmitter beams out radio waves, and as those waves bounce off of objects in their path, some of their energy is reflected back to the radar equipment. How much energy comes back and the angle that it comes in at tells you something about the size and distance of any objects out there that the radio waves are running up against. It's basically, you can think of it as being like sonar or echolocation, but with radio waves instead of sound. Now, British scientists had figured all of this out by the 1930s. And so by the time World War II officially broke out, Great Britain had built a network of radar stations up and down the British coast as an early warning system to detect planes coming from the European mainland. But pretty much as soon as all of these radar stations were operational, they started to pick up some weird signals. Planes generally plodded along at consistent speeds and trajectories when viewed on the radar screen, but they were seeing these other strange things that appeared and disappeared and changed direction at random. Supposedly, at one point, a red alert was sounded and British fighter planes were urgently ordered into the air to intercept strange signals over the English Channel, only to get up into the sky and find nothing there. And so the exasperated radar operators started calling these weird signals radar angels. Excuse me. All right. While all this had been going on, this guy, whose name was David Lack, had been teaching science at a secondary school in Devonshire in southwestern England, and he didn't know it yet, but he was about to become the father of radar ornithology. So again, David Lack was a young man at the point in time that we're going to be talking about. There aren't any photos out there of young David Lack because he didn't get famous till later. So you're going to have to imagine this guy as a young man. Lack had always been interested in birds. He had studied ornithology when he was at Cambridge. And in 1938, he took a year off from his teaching job to travel to the Galapagos Islands to study Darwin's famous finches there. He got back to the UK just as war was breaking out, and David Lack later wrote a short memoir about these early years of his career. So I'm going to read in his own words what happened next when he arrived back in England on the brink of war. I had become a pacifist at the age of 17, so he'd signed a pledge to an anti-war organization. And in the autumn of 1940, I decided that I ought to leave my job at the school to work with a pacifist unit. I spent a trial night in the East End of London during heavy raids, but was so put off by the pacifists' earnest attitudes and so excited by the flashes and bangs that I was immediately converted from pacifism. A month later, the Central Register for Scientific Workers sent me to interview for an unspecified job. So he's joining the war effort, but because he has a science background, they want to give him a special science job. As a biologist, you will of course have learned a lot of physics, the interviewer said. I'm afraid not, I answered. Well, I expect your maths is of a high standard. I'm afraid not. Then, very doubtfully, I fear this job will often entail going out in the wet and cold in the dark. Would you mind that? Not at all. So I was taken on and 10 days later set off from London with 19 other biologists on a mystery coach tour. You see where this is going? Lack was assigned to a job working on radar systems. The first place he was posted was to the Orkneys, which are a wet, windy, remote group of islands off the north end of Scotland. I gather that he was probably the only person happy to be sent to work there because the birding was really good and he got to spend all of his off hours scrambling around on the rocks looking for birds like puffins and skuas. But after this, he was on a tour of radar installations up and down the British coast when he was reintroduced to an old classmate of his from Cambridge named George Varley, our third George of the evening. It was a popular name for mid-century biologists. So Varley, as I said, was an old classmate of Lack's from Cambridge. Varley had been an entomologist before the war, so a bug scientist, but now he had fallen into the same line of work as Lack. Apparently, any science degree was good enough to get you a job working on radar. And it was Varley who introduced Lack to the mystery of the angels plaguing the radar operators. Now, David Lack was an ornithologist by training. He was familiar with the behavior of birds in flight. He heard this whole long description of these mysterious radar angels, and he pretty much immediately was like, guys, it's birds. Nobody believed him. So Lack and Varley decided that they were going to put their heads together and prove that this is what was happening. They got pretty creative about it. At one point, they actually convinced an officer to tie a dead gull to a balloon and send it up into the air in front of a radar station just to demonstrate that it was at least possible for a bird body to produce a radar signal. But finally, in September 1941, they managed to use a powerful telescope to confirm that the source of a signal being tracked offshore in real time was in fact a flock of gannets, which is what you see here. And as the war continued, Lack and Varley kept collecting radar observations that they believed represented birds. The technology was advancing really fast, so pretty quickly they went from only seeing big birds like gannets and geese showing up on radar to being able to pick up things like flocks of starlings. And they just continued to confirm more and more that the characteristics of the so-called angels, like their airspeed and their tendency to fly with or against the wind, were consistent with the behavior of birds in flight. Again, it took a long time to convince everyone, and so I want to read one more brief David Lack quote, just because I love this man's sense of humor. At one meeting, he wrote, after the physicists had again gravely explained that clouds of ions must be responsible, Varley with equal gravity accepted their view, providing that the ions were wrapped in feathers. So finally, in 1945, as the end of the war neared, they got permission to publish their previously top secret findings in the journal Nature. This publication basically kicked off the whole subdiscipline that's now known as radar ornithology. Today, Lack, who died in 1973, is better remembered for a book that he wrote about Darwin's finches, but I think he also gets the credit for this. Now, radar ornithology might have been a footnote in my book instead of an entire chapter, if not for the fact that after the war, another group of scientists, meteorologists, quickly started developing radar technology as a way to provide early warnings about hurricanes and other major storms. Large flocks of birds showed up just as well on weather radar as they had on military radar, so building a nationwide network of radar stations was fantastic news for ornithologists interested in large-scale migration patterns. And over time, advances in weather radar, like the introduction of Doppler technology, have just made it possible to gather better and better data about migration this way. Excuse me. So in 2018, I want to talk really briefly about a paper that I think shows the power of this kind of data. In 2018, two scientists put their heads together and they downloaded radar scans covering every evening for the past 23 years. So this was more than 150,000 total individual radar scans. They analyzed them to see how weather factors like temperature and wind and air pressure were related to the appearance of big migration movements on radar. Because of course, during bird migration season, every night does not have an equal number of birds aloft. There's big nights and there's quiet nights. And so they found that by doing this analysis, they could use the weather to explain almost 80% of the variation in migration intensity from one night to the next. And they could even use this method to predict big migratory movements several days in advance. So if any of you use this tool, Birdcast, which is this amazing website run by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, where you can log on during migration and get a forecast for exactly how many birds are going to be flying over your area that night. This is the technology that it's based on, and it is all thanks to a witty science teacher from Devonshire who realized what must really be going on with those mysterious so-called angels annoying the radar operators guarding England from the Nazis. But of course, radar is not the only way to put radio waves to work tracking birds. And this brings me to my third and favorite migration maverick, if you will, that we're going to hear about this evening. So this man's name is Bill Cochran. You've got young Bill Cochran on the left, and then Bill Cochran later in his career on the right. In the mid-1950s, Bill Cochran was a young Navy veteran working on an electrical engineering degree part-time, while also working for a brand new television station based in Champaign, Illinois. One morning, he went out to check on his employer's transmitter tower on the outskirts of town, and there was a guy there picking up dead birds from the ground. Cochran thought this was odd and interesting and started peppering the man with questions. It turns out that his name was Richard Graber, and he was an ornithologist from the University of Illinois who was studying tower kills, which is a phenomenon where flocks of birds fly into communications towers and are killed by the impact. Cochran was intrigued. I'm guessing it might not have occurred to him that studying birds could be a job. And pretty soon he was spending all of his spare time kind of tinkering together gadgets to help Graber with his research. Bill Cochran appears in more chapters of my book than any other single scientist. The first project that he and Graber worked on together was figuring out a way to record the nocturnal flight calls of birds passing overhead at night. So I'm sure some of you know night migrating songbirds, while they're flying at night, they make these unique calls that some of them don't make any other time. Cochran and Graber were the first people to actually make recordings of these calls. And one of my favorite little stories from the whole book is Bill Cochran, the electrical engineering student, figuring out how to rig up a tape recorder with bicycle axles to hold the 6,000 feet of tape that they would need to record an entire 8-hour night of birds passing overhead. I love it. But the chapter in my book where Bill Cochran looms the largest is the one on radio telemetry. So telemetry just means transmitting data from one place to another in real time. And there were two technological advances right around this time that really helped kick off the field of radio telemetry. The first was the invention of the transistor in 1947. Before this, radios relied on bulky, breakable vacuum tubes to amplify the signals that they sent out. Transistors, to take a technical topic and simplify it greatly, provided a lightweight, efficient, durable way of doing the same thing. And so they made it possible to adapt radios for all sorts of tasks that they wouldn't have been suited for before, including transmitting all kinds of data from one place to another. One of the first groups to actually jump in and start experimenting this was the US Navy. And they quickly started trying things like using radio signals to transmit real-time data on a jet pilot's vital signs to someone monitoring them from the ground, and studying the effectiveness of cold water suits for sailors by transmitting the temperature inside the suit. But it did not take long for wildlife researchers to begin borrowing these same techniques. I think in a way, my whole book is just a history of ornithologists being really good at borrowing advances from all of these other areas of science. In 1957, scientists in Antarctica used the system from the cold water suit tests to remotely monitor the temperature of a penguin egg during incubation. That's what's going on here. Those are penguins being manhandled in the lower right corner. That same year, a group of researchers in Maryland borrowed some ideas from the Jet Pilot project and surgically implanted transmitters in woodchucks to monitor their movements as they moved around a small nature preserve. Soon, big engineering firms like Honeywell were getting involved, trying to design radio tracking systems that they could sell to wildlife biologists to use to track animals' movements. But they were trying things like strapping a metal box containing a radio transmitter onto the back of a grouse and releasing it into the bushes. And it turns out that a grouse with a metal box strapped to its back does not last very long in the wild. So before wildlife telemetry could really take off, someone was literally going to have to think outside the box, and that someone turned out to be Bill Cochran. I'm sorry for the bad pun, I couldn't resist. So I did say 2 technological advances. The first one was the invention of the transistor. The second one that factored into all of this was the launch of Sputnik in 1957. I am pretty sure I am the only person going around giving a talk to local Audubon groups who has photos of the first transistor and, well, this isn't a photo, but illustrations of the first transistor and Sputnik in my presentation. Sputnik, of course, was the first artificial satellite. It was launched by the Soviets. And basically, all it did was circle the Earth and beep. But if you had a radio receiver and you knew what you were doing, you could pick up that beep from anywhere on Earth. And this touched off a whole new wave of fascination with radio technology. So by 1960, Bill Cochran, who still had not actually finished his electrical engineering degree, but was apparently something of a transistor savant, if you will, had picked up more part-time work helping a University of Illinois astronomer build radio beacons that were going to be sent up on some of the first US satellites. Actually, some of the first US spy satellites, but they did not know that that's what they were working on. Cochran was also still doing work for Richard Graeber, the ornithologist, and his colleagues over at the Illinois Natural History Survey. And eventually someone there suggested they try combining Cochran's 2 part-time gigs and putting a radio transmitter on a duck. Why not? Let's see what happens. So they sent over a duck from the field station on the Illinois River to the satellite lab, and they used a metal band to strap a radio transmitter onto this bird's chest. And they hadn't planned this at all, but it turned out that the bird's breathing distorted this metal band in a way that affected the radio signal. And when they released the duck, they could track its respiratory rate as it flew, and it turned out that they had accidentally collected the first data on the physiology of a bird in flight. And so the moment this duck wearing this transmitter took flight, that was the beginning of the rest of Bill Cochran's career. He was hooked, he loved this, and he spent the next decades and decades building radio transmitters to go on wild animals. And he was really good at it. So building a radio transmitter that a wild animal is going to wear as it goes about its daily business requires making trade-offs among a long list of factors. A longer antenna will give you a stronger signal. A bigger battery will give you a longer lasting device, but they both add weight. And Cochran, who would not officially finish that electrical engineering degree for several more years, turned out to be really good at getting this balance just right. He favored designs that were as small and simple and compact as possible. And instead of putting all of his components into a metal box, he came up with a method of dipping the whole assembly in plastic resin to seal and waterproof everything together. He started out working on rabbits and other mammals in that size range with biologists doing surveys, but it didn't take very long before he was building transmitters that were small enough that they could safely be carried by a large songbird. And this was great news for his old friend and mentor, the ornithologist Richard Graeber, because Graeber had a particular interest in thrushes, which are a large songbird. So in 1965, Richard Graeber managed to find a pilot willing to try following a migrating radio-tagged thrush at night via small plane. Because the thing was, these devices, they only had a range of a few miles. So if you wanted to use one to follow a migrating bird, you literally had to follow the migrating bird. So that's their plane on the left there. You can just see some of the antenna sticking out of it. They apparently nicknamed it the porcupine because of all the antenna for picking up the radio signals. In May 1965, they captured a gray-cheeked thrush outside Urbana, Illinois. They trimmed the feathers from a little patch on its back, and they stuck on a radio transmitter using eyelash glue, the same stuff that you would use to attach false eyelashes to your face. This is actually still very popular for this sort of thing because eyelash glue is non-toxic, it doesn't irritate the skin, and it wears off on its own after a while. And I digress a little bit, but I have this mental image of generations of macho wildlife biologists having to learn exactly where the eyelash glue is kept at the local cosmetic store. Anyway, that night, Graeber and the pilot followed this bird north for 400 miles before turning around, 200 of which were over the open water of Lake Michigan. They weren't able to see the bird, of course. They were just flying through the night, listening to this wavering beep, beep, beep in the cockpit of the plane. And Graeber, contemplating what this bird was doing, was so awed that he later compared this experience to the feelings of awe that he felt watching the television coverage of the Apollo moon missions. And Bill Cochran, the engineer, was just getting started. In 1973, Cochran and a student named Charles Welling tag another thrush passing through Illinois in the spring, and this time they spend a full week following this bird almost 1,000 miles all the way across the Canadian border and up into Manitoba in a station wagon with a hole cut in the top for their radio receiver. This was later written up in a very dry 2-page scientific paper. And when I stumbled across it, I'm just reading this being like, they did what? Because it's bonkers, right? They had some adventures along the way. At one point, Welling, the student who was along to help drive, basically spent a night in jail when a suspicious police officer pulled them over in rural Minnesota, because who wouldn't be suspicious of this thing driving through your town in rural Minnesota in the middle of the night? They didn't want to lose the bird's signal, so Cochran basically kicked the kid out of the car, kept on driving until the bird set down at dawn, and doubled back and bailed him out and sorted things out, and they kept on going. As they went, they gathered data on the bird's altitude, its airspeed and ground speed, the distance it covered each night, and its heading. And because they were able to stick with this one bird over such a long distance, Cochran and Welling were actually able to track how the precise direction that the bird set out in each night changed as its position changed relative to magnetic north, which provided some of the first real-world evidence that migrating songbirds use some sort of internal magnetic compass as one of their tools for navigation. They were finally forced to stop when their car's engine gave out after they crossed into Canada, or they probably would have kept it up even longer. So Bill Cochran, my impression is that he may not have been the easiest dude to get along with on a personal level. He was sort of a eccentric, crotchety guy. He never really got the hang of the politics of academia. Again, he was an engineer by training, so he was a little bit of an outsider among all of these biologists. He never really quite seemed to fully grasp how the peer review system for academic publishing worked. Some of the things that he did, he published in scientific journals, and some of them he published in things like hobbyist magazines for falconry enthusiasts. He didn't really seem exactly to know what to do to publicize all the things he was accomplishing. By the late 1990s, he had left his job with the Illinois Natural History Survey on what I gather were maybe less than good terms. But he kept building radio systems for ornithologists in his garage right into the beginning of this century. And every time I have given this talk for an audience of ornithologists, I have met more people who have more Bill Cochran stories. I think someone could write an entire book just about his adventures. I had the great good fortune to speak to Bill multiple times while I was researching my book, and even to visit him at his home in Illinois, where this station wagon was still in the driveway and most of his backyard was taken up with an enormous radio receiver tower. He was a hilarious character. He loved to screen his calls by pretending to be a janitor in an animal shelter when he answered the phone. So I would call him at a prearranged time for a phone interview, and he'd pick up and go, "Animal shelter, we're closed." You're like, "Bill, is that you?" Anyway, he was just a hoot. I feel really privileged that I got to know him a little bit. Sadly, he passed away in summer 2022 at the age of 90. I really believe that he is an unsung hero of 20th century science, and I'm happy that my book is hopefully going to make more people aware of all of the things that he accomplished. So I'm reaching my last couple slides here. In my last few minutes, as I mentioned, I'm going to talk really briefly about the concept of migratory connectivity and why all of this matters for bird conservation. When I was first writing this talk, I intentionally chose some of the more historical stories from the book because I mentioned I've given this talk for audiences of ornithologists, and I wanted to avoid a situation where I might be talking about someone who was in the audience. That just seemed awkward. So, not to put too fine a point on it, I promise if you read the book, it's not all dead white guys. I cover in the book, I get to also write about a lot of the more recent developments in this field, like the latest miniaturized tracking devices, the latest artificial intelligence tools for analyzing big data sets, high volume genetic sequencing, all that stuff. And I also got to talk to and write about a really wonderful wide range of people from all over the world who are doing this sort of work. I had the fun of scheduling a Zoom call across many hours of time difference with a Mongolian ornithologist. One of my favorite people that I met was a really lovely woman from Colombia who's using today's version of radio telemetry to study thrush migration. Thanks to all of these recent high-tech advances, we now have a clearer and more detailed picture of bird migration than ever before. That sort of data can help us target conservation efforts effectively. And that is really important right now because migratory birds are not doing so well. I'm sure that some of you heard of this paper when it came out back in 2019. This is what was called the 3 billion birds paper, and it generated a little flurry of media coverage. A large group of scientists drew on data from a lot of different sources, and they came up with an estimate that there are 2.9 billion with a B fewer breeding birds now in North America than there were in 1970. That's almost a 30% decline. It's just staggering. Researchers and wildlife managers have been scrambling to try to figure out how to stop the bleeding. And so I was coming to the end of my book manuscript. I needed to write a conclusion and tie a bow on the whole thing. And I decided that I wanted to try to tackle the question of whether some of these new tracking technologies might be at least part of the answer for this, and just whether there's any reason to feel hopeful when we look at numbers like this. And so part of how I did that was to get in touch with a couple of the leading experts today on migratory bird conservation and ask them what they thought. So I talked to Pete Mara, who was one of the senior authors of this paper and co-founder of the Road to Recovery initiative that grew out of it. And I also talked to Jill Deppy, who's the director of the Audubon Society's Migratory Bird Initiative. These are both very busy people who were very kind to take some time out of their day and let me call them up and ask them laughably broad questions like, what is the state of migratory bird conservation today? Which is probably a terrible interview question. And they both had strikingly similar things to say. They agreed that despite all the ever more detailed migration research that's happening now, we still need more data to understand what's behind the declines of many of these species. So if you ever think, why are we still sinking all of this funding into migration tracking when we should be spending all of it on conservation? The answer is we don't even know what the problems are for some of these species. They agreed that there is a need to get better at consolidating the data that is being collected and getting it into the hands of people who can use it, like policymakers and conservation activists. They agreed that we need to get better at working across international borders and incorporating more partners in the social sciences, more perspectives from Indigenous people. And somewhat to my surprise, they both insisted that yes, there is still reason for hope. And so I want to close just by reading a little bit of what Pete Mara said when I asked him if he feels optimistic about the future. He said, "I'm very optimistic. We've done this in the past. we've corrected other environmental issues, and now we have to deal with climate change. So while it seems like there's this overwhelming deluge of negative issues and challenges with getting people on board with these things and constant pressures on nature, I choose to be optimistic and hopeful just because I don't see any benefit of being pessimistic or having a lack of hope. I just don't choose to take that route. Don't get me wrong, there are times when I might be negative or spiraling down into a pit of agony, but I'm not going to do that. I thought those were wise words. And I don't know about you all, but when I find myself spiraling down into a pit of agony, I usually just go birding. So that's what I've got for you this evening. Again, this is my book. It's called Flight Paths. It's available wherever you like to buy books. And this is my website, RebeccaHeisman.com, where you can find links to that book. If anyone is moved to buy a copy of the book and read the whole thing after hearing my talk this evening, I swear my talk barely scratched the surface. And you would like, I'm not there to physically sign books, but if you buy a copy and you would like a signed book plate sticker, you'll find a contact form on my website that goes right to my email. So shoot me an email and I would love to drop a signed book plate sticker in the mail for you. The other thing you can find on my website is you can sign up for my monthly email newsletter where I talk about writing that I'm doing, but also book recommendations and other cool bird stuff from across the web. The number one question that I think I get is, are you working on a second book? And the answer is no, not yet. But if you want to find out if and when that happens, the best thing to do would be to subscribe to my newsletter. It's just one email a month. So I'm going to look at the questions in the chat. Is it also okay if people who want to ask a question just unmute themselves and turn on their video? And okay, yeah.
Yeah, that's fine.
Cool. So I'm going to look at the chat here. So Barbara Lindeke asks, have our loons recovered from the blown oil platform in the Gulf of Mexico a few years ago? That is not a topic that I'm super knowledgeable about, I'm afraid. I'm sure you could find some information about that on the internet, but I am not certain. When we're talking about things like the 3 billion birds paper, that these migratory declines, the big contributors to this are habitat loss, and actually the other big sources of mortality for birds in North America are collisions with buildings and feral cats. And climate change is probably going to be coming up that list in the upcoming decades. In your episode, Debbie Brown asks, in your opinion, what is one of the next important questions about bird migration that we need to answer? So I don't know that there's one big overarching question about all of bird migration, as there are a lot of little questions. So I just barely touched on this question of migratory connectivity. That another buzzword in migration research right now is called full annual cycle research, which is where if a bird species is declining and we want to be able to fix whatever the problem is so that its population can stabilize, if it's a migratory species, we don't know if the problem that's causing its population to decline is in its breeding grounds or its wintering grounds or it's some crucial stopover that they use on migration. So that's really the current frontier, I think, in bird migration research, is trying to collect that level of detailed granular data for each of these species so that we can kind of figure out what holes we need to plug. I hope that addresses your question. Oh, Cassandra Swan says, I finished reading your book yesterday and I loved it. Thank you. I'm so glad. What other data sources are really big besides what the Cornell lab has through eBird, asks Craig Fisk. So eBird is huge. There's a whole chapter in my book just about community science where I talk quite a lot about eBird. The other sort of community science program that's really important is the Breeding Bird Survey, where people go out along road routes every spring and do roadside point counts. That's been going on for so long that's used to, that's one of the primary sources where we tell whether a population is going up or down. What other data sources are really big? I mean, all of these different little tracking devices, if you want to look at migration patterns for individual birds, and there's a lot of different kinds of little tracking devices that you can stick on birds. I talk about all of those in the book. Radar, which I talked about, is a big one. So there's a lot, and they're getting better at integrating data from different sources to kind of get clearer pictures. Elizabeth Classmore says, wonderful presentation. Can you talk about the MODIS tracking system? I can talk about the MODIS tracking system. I love the MODIS tracking system. So the chapter in my book that talks about radio telemetry is like half Bill Cochran and the origins of radio telemetry, and then half getting into MODIS, which is sort of the current iteration of this. I mentioned that radio transmitters only have a range of a few miles. So the way they are starting to overcome this is building this network of receiver towers all across North America, and it's expanding into other continents now. And then you put a transmitter on a bird, and each of these transmitters has sort of its own unique code that it sends out. And every time this bird flies within range of one of these stations, this receiver tower picks it up and says like, aha, bird number 8003 like flew past me yesterday. And so as the network of these receiver stations becomes more dense, this is getting to be a better and better method for getting some data about where a bird goes after you let it go. And I mentioned really briefly the woman in Colombia who's studying thrushes. This is what her study focused on, was MODIS. But yes, I talked to the guy who runs MODIS. I love MODIS. Is there anyone else? You can put it in the chat, or you can just unmute yourself if you want to ask anything.
Rebecca, I'm just wondering if we had you back in a year or two, is there any technology you ran across that's just, you just went, what? Or just would be just totally mind blowing for us in a couple of years from now?
Oh, that's a really good question. I mean, the little transmitters are they're figuring out how to build smaller and smaller and smaller ones all the time. So like the lower limit of how small of a bird can you put them on is always decreasing, which is really cool. So that's a bit, and they're adding more and more sensors to them. Like now you can put one of these things on a bird, and it might not only tell you where the bird is, but like the barometric pressure where that it was flying through, and the altitude that it was flying at, and like the wind conditions that it was experiencing in the sky, and all of this amazing detail. So that's pretty phenomenal. I briefly mentioned nocturnal flight calls. And so there are folks who are working on being able to make better use of that data by developing artificial intelligence to be able to identify all of these little very similar calls. So that's one. The Bird Gene Escape project, where they're using high volume genetic sequencing to basically develop 23andMe for birds, is also really cool. So there's several.
Wow, that's exciting.
Someone asks, are you familiar with some of the info from Snowstorm Snowy Owl tracking that's coming in? I've heard of that project. I believe that's Scott Wiedensahl's project, if I'm not mistaken. Scott is fantastic. He wrote a very kind blurb for my book. I don't know a whole lot of detail about Project Snowstorm, but I've certainly heard of it.
Any other questions there, Rebecca, we didn't touch on?
I don't think so. I think I caught everything that was in the chat.
Wow, I know that there's a lot of things you didn't read, which said wonderful presentation. Thank you so much. Fantastic talk.
Thank you.
And I would definitely agree, and I'm sure much of our audience would too. So I truly appreciate your time this evening and the work that you're doing. I think bringing visibility to all this really helps birds and helps us all. So with that, unless there's any other, well, did something else come in here, or is that more of a
I don't see
talk?
anything.
So I think we're good. I really want to say thank you for your time this evening, and I'd love to have you back again to talk about. I know, wasn't the Rosie Finch project that you talked about in a magazine?
Oh yeah, the American Bird Conservancy had me write a
Yeah,
feature about rosy finches. That was
yeah,
fun.
that was
I
a
do all
wonderful
sorts of
article.
stuff.
I mean, that in itself would be a nice presentation too. So
Yeah,
I hope we can have you back sometime to give
yeah,
us a
I'd
little
love
bit
to.
more of your wisdom and expertise. So thank you everybody for joining this evening. Please send us an email through our website if you have any other additional comments. And everybody have a warm and wonderful evening. Thank you.
Thank you.